battery power. We never seem to have enough. Well, Franco, you moderated a panel and a whole session on storage, energy storage, and one of the things that impressed me was that this conference, the IDTech conference, is looking at all these different things, whether they be internet sensors, whether they be smartphones, consumer electronics, or cars, things that require storage going forward and how they all interrelate. And you just spoke on a panel about storage, and that was one of the things, I guess, that impressed me, was this interrelationship of these things. Why don't you talk to that for a moment, and we'll have a conversation.
Yes, Ken, thank you very much for attending our conference. At IDTechEx, we focus on emerging technologies in different sectors and industries, and we have the detected energy storage technologies are a key enabling technology that cuts across many technologies and industries, from wearable electronics, electric vehicles, Internet of Things, and the development of battery technologies has been incremental in the last 25 years, if we think about lithium-ion. And now we've seen since the last couple of years developments by many companies in the next generation of energy storage technologies, including established companies, as we just saw from Samsung, and the perspective of the end users such as Intel, trying to push forward the next generation of consumer electronics and the next generation of batteries for enabling the kickstart of electric vehicles.
One of the things that take away from me from the Intel presentation was this idea of that there's multiple vectors to look at, and you may see a headline for, hey, it's got all this great energy storage, but then there's a lot of other things that have to be factored in, right?
Yeah, that's right. As Andy from Intel, he's a quite knowledgeable person in the industry and quite experienced. As he rightly pointed, most of the companies they promote one parameter, which is usually energy density, but we need to take in consideration different parameters such as cycle life, the power capacity, and the temperature range in which these battery technologies can operate. So it's just people need to look at different parameters, not just energy density.
Well, and the other thing, too, is he also pointed out that it may not work for all applications, but it may work for one application, and that's what you need to kind of get something started, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is a very important point because many companies focus on the specification of the automotive sector, for example, or the traditional consumer electronics. And the achievements in technology development that some of these new startup companies have achieved now might be very good enough for some emerging segments such as drones or some wearable electronics that don't necessarily require, for example, the same number of cycles that the automotive sector is requiring. So some technologies have reached the level of it is good enough for some of these alternative market segments.
Now, looking ahead to 2020, one of the things that was a big surprise for me was the size of the market you're projecting for electric buses.
Yeah, that's right. We've been analyzing different emerging segments of electric vehicles. We analyzed around 46 different categories of electric vehicles, and we've been surprised by the growth rate of the electric bus market. But this has been mostly supported by economic policy in China, in which the government has put a strong incentives for the development of an adoption of electric buses. And we now see increasingly Western companies actually developing also interesting concepts for electric buses, both in the US and Europe.
What are some of those concepts that you find interesting?
Well, such as fast charging, which is one of the, there are two concepts of fast charging, and the traditional is in station charging during the night, but fast charging is an interesting concept. Companies such as ABB in Europe have developed like fast charging infrastructure, which is quite interesting.
And so from an autonomy standpoint, I suppose, is that going hand in hand with that, making these buses autonomous as well, or is that largely decoupled?
Yeah, I think that you mentioned a really good point. I think there's a interesting convergence between autonomy and buses that has those few companies have pointed out. Only Tesla, I think, recently has pointed out the idea of having next generation of electric buses with autonomy, which actually may have a very interesting role in the future, mostly because they could be what the new generation of trains is, we think about it, because you can couple different buses and in different routes, dedicated routes, because in most places buses have dedicated lanes. So the autonomy brings a different next level that could be very interesting to see.
Yeah, dynamic coupling and decoupling of the actual buses to form virtual trains, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah, it is there. I think an interesting possibility there.
Now, do you think it'll also drive the development of the new kinds of batteries that perhaps will provide, these other improvements in various vectors?
Well, as one of the points I mentioned, and I think it was you. Well, you raised a question about different concepts in electric buses. One of the characteristics of electric buses is that they have specified operation routes and stops, so that facilitates the design of a battery, because there are different types of battery that respond to energy and power. So having a quite more or less defined operational parameters of bus facilitates the work of battery designers, and maybe some of these technologies, as I mentioned, that perhaps they might not be ready for the variable performance, constant acceleration, the acceleration of personal cars. They might have easier introduction point in electric buses.
Excellent. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And Franco, I appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure, Ken. Thank you very much for coming.